Hey, everybody. Good evening. My name is Catherine Matthews, and I am the Director of Education at the Old North Church and Historic Site. Please note, if you haven't already, that tonight's program is being recorded. And additionally, we do ask that you keep yourself on mute until the Q&A, when we do hope you will join the conversation. So as we begin, let us take time to acknowledge those who came before us and whose stories may not be widely known. At the Old North Foundation, we work every day to deepen our knowledge of the past and to share our history with honesty and respect for those who came before us. Part of that history is the story of the land and its guardians. Old North site was once the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. When Old North was founded in 1723, the Massachusetts communities in this area had already been decimated by disease and warfare, trafficked into enslavement, removed from their homes, and forced to assimilate into European culture. Despite this devastating reality, the Massachusetts people survived, and their descendants carry on the knowledge and tradition of their ancestors. Their story is part of our shared American story. Thank you, all of you, for being with us tonight for our third and final program in a series exploring the life and legacy of David Walker. All of our fall and winter speaker series programming, including tonight, has been made possible by the generous support of Citizens Bank. Our next event will take place on March 16th, when Kathleen Waldvogel will share the story of the research that culminated in her book, Spies, Soldiers, Couriers, and Saboteurs, Women of the American Revolution. Hers was a 6-year project of exploring lesser-known stories that are part of our shared history. You can register as of tonight on Eventbrite. So for many of us, David Walker's life and work have been among those lesser-known stories. Walker was a 19th century Black activist and author, born in North Carolina, but who eventually came to Boston, where he was part of the active and vibrant community fighting for the abolition of slavery. Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world wove passionate rhetoric and relentless reason together to galvanize the Black community, both free and enslaved, to fight for one another and for freedom. In his appeal, Walker asserted, "America is as much our country as it is yours." This undeniably true statement is one that group after group have had to voice over the centuries. Tonight, Old North's Executive Director, Nikki Stewart, will facilitate a panel discussion between Professors Cabria Baumgartner, Jonathan Chu, and Jessica Linker. Their conversation will focus on the conflict between belonging and excluding in this nation's history, and explore questions such as, what does it mean to be a citizen? And how can communities assert belonging when their stories have been erased? And now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's program participants. Cabria Baumgartner is a Dean's Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Northeastern University. She is a historian of the 19th century United States, specializing in the history of education, of African-American women's and gender history, and the history of New England. An award-winning author, Professor Baumgartner is currently writing a book about the history of civil rights in 19th century Boston. Jonathan Chu is a professor of history at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the editor of the New England Quarterly. He has written on a diverse range of topics, including the treatment of Quaker descent in Massachusetts and the Chinese Exclusion Act. He, with Mary Ann Brink, is currently working on Muddy Waters, which is a study of separatist movements in the Trans-Appalachian West in the early Republic years. And Jessica Linker is an assistant professor of history at Northeastern University. She is an early Americanist by training and a digital humanities practitioner specializing in 3D and virtual reality technologies. Professor Linker is faculty lead for 3D Black Boston, a project that aims to create museum sites that reconstruct spaces related to pre-Civil War Black heritage sites here in Boston. Currently, she is working on sites related to David Walker. And finally, Nikki Stewart is the executive director of the Old North Foundation. She's an experienced leader in the nonprofit sector, a passionate lover of history, and a staunch advocate for social justice. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Nikki.
Thanks, Catherine. Also, just want to thank everyone who is joining us tonight, but especially our panelists. And as we are moving through the discussion, if anyone has questions that they would like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll pause occasionally and Catherine will read those questions as they accumulate. So as we get the discussion started, I'd like to start with a question about terminology and language, because we're going to use the phrase American to talk about themes of nationality, identity, culture, and citizenship. And so, Jonathan, I want to pose the question to you and then open it up to our other panelists. When did the term American come into use, and how has that meaning changed over time, or has the meaning changed over time?
Jonathan, you're on mute.
You are
I'm sorry. Thank you, Nikki. There's no simple answer, because the whole notion of citizenship depends upon a set of assumptions, and more often than not, it's when those assumptions are confronted with the challenge of the other, someone who's not. But what proves over the course of American history is the way in which the terminology shifts because the assumptions shift. The very first Naturalization Act decreed that persons of white ancestry could become naturalized citizens of the United States, 1795. That changes after the Civil War. So they changed the Naturalization Act to include people of African descent. Nobody has in mind what's going to happen to people who aren't white or African. In the late 19th century, the Immigration and Naturalization Bureau gets established, and it has the job of trying to define who can be a citizen. Well, in 1882, for political reasons, they decide that Chinese can't be in. So, the Naturalization Act that said only whites and blacks could be naturalized must apply, and Asians can't. One of the problems with that is that there are no clear notions of what constitutes white or black or Asian. In point of fact, they're not even sure that all whites are one race. So one has the unique situation when the Immigration and Naturalization Service adopts a racial category of a fellow by the name of Johann von Blumenbach. Put this all together in 1795, a century before. And what Blumenbach did was to organize the world's races in 5 different categories. And each of the categories has subcategories. So there were Caucasian, there was African, there was Malay, American, and for lack of a better term, I guess, East Asian. One of the things that makes this really unique is, of course, that the Americans, indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, generally, couldn't be naturalized. They were neither white nor black. Asians, of course, couldn't be. Native Americans who were born in the United States weren't considered citizens until 1924. Somewhere around the time of the Cold War, these things break down, mostly because World War II creates 2 Asian nations facing each other, and the Chinese are the good guys and the Japanese are the bad guys. It's really not until the 1960s that we actually start to use informally in sociological, anthropological terms, 3 different races. When I lecture to my students, the whole notion of being an American is somehow sort of identifying the outsider. But one of the unique things about the American system is because the terms are somewhat ambiguous, and because the 14th Amendment grants citizenship, birthright citizenship, to anyone born within the territory of the United States, that completely blurs the line. One of my favorite books for ironies is a book about Independence Hall. And as the debates in Independence Hall are taking place about freedom, about rights, Independence Hall sits on the boundary between a fairly upscale neighborhood and, of course, the African American community in Philadelphia. So there's this wonderful irony that as white Protestant Americans, with the rare exception of a Catholic or two, are debating what to do about their rights with regard to British tyranny, there are African Americans sitting outside who are part of this story and who learn to use the language of rights. And that's what David Walker has done and is doing in the process. So in some ways, being an American or identifying an American has a set of cultural and legal terms. And it's the interaction of the cultural and legal terms that gets appropriated by people that the founding fathers never envisioned would happen. President Obama and I share a common high school. And it was a school founded by Congregationalist missionaries who went out to Hawaii in the 1840s. And I know those missionaries never envisioned, certainly not President Obama, and I sincerely believe probably not even that a Chinese American kid from Hawaii would be a student of early American history.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's a very comprehensive kind of introduction for us. I want to pose a question to our panelists about your personal relationship to the identity of being American, which I think varies a lot from one American citizen to the next, how much we think of that as, you know, part of our being and part of who we are. And, you know, as I was reflecting about my relationship to being American, I've also been thinking about how different it might be in different parts of the country. You know, for example, I am from one of the original 13 colonies, and that probably changes how I've learned American history as opposed to someone who has grown up and learned history in another place. Jessica, do you want to kick us off and just share a little bit about your identity and your relationship to the word?
Yeah, and I thought this was the hardest question of them all. You know, so growing up, like I definitely had this sense that Americanness was about citizenship, but that citizenship was often ambiguously defined in ways about freedom and democracy and a sense of exceptionalism, but it wasn't always clear. And that's just what I got out of grade school, that I should generally just be proud of being American without any sense of nuance. And also because I grew up in New England, many of my classmates would just talk about this long-standing genealogical connection with the past that I personally couldn't identify with. Like many of my, all of my family immigrated here in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I did not have that long connection to sort of like New England's colonial past. And degrees of separation from that still seem to matter a little bit when I was growing up. when I got older and more interested in politics, I think I started to think about being American as a series of sort of contractual and ethical responsibilities, like to my community, to the country, and as a representative of the country and the world. And sort of more specifically as a historian, like I think this means like understanding all of the nuances, sort of good and bad and difficult about our country's past, which seems to be challenged very much these days. But I think it's important to understand, you know, how we came to be who we are today, including all the messy and bad bits. And there are social justice goals in this kind of thinking, like there are structures of power that just govern society and that these change over time. And my job as an American is to teach students, an American and a historian, is to think about like how to teach students to identify these structures of power, how to understand them, and how to work to untangle like current problems in our society that are caused by the legacy of these hierarchies.
Hey, thank you. Cabria, would you like to share your thoughts as well?
Sure, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to take part in this conversation. And this is sort of a challenging question. I was thinking about my upbringing as well, thinking about childhood and when I felt most American. And I have to say, I immediately thought about songs, right, and music, particularly patriotic songs that I remember singing as a child. So I can still recite the lyrics to America the Beautiful, or This Land Is Our Land, and of course the national anthem. And I think in those moments there was a sense of pride, and so in that sense I share Jessica's experience. I felt very prideful being an American and those sort of American values of freedom and liberty. But I think I didn't fully appreciate or understand Americanness probably until I got my passport and had the opportunity to live abroad. And I think that was that happened in an earlier period of my life. And so I really got to see America from a different perspective. I lived in Berlin, Germany for about 2 years. This was in the mid 2000s. So the context here is sort of American foreign policy and the Iraq War. And it was really interesting sort of being in Berlin as an African-American woman. One, because a lot of people, when they met me before I said anything, they thought I was African. They thought I was from Nigeria. And that's because there's a fairly large, fairly sizable population of African immigrants, of Nigerian immigrants. So it makes sense that I would be read in that way, but that was a surprise to me, right, having come from the US. And then on top of that, there was the foreign policy issues in the United States at that point that made it difficult for me because on the one hand, I wanted to defend my country, right? I wanted to talk about all that was good about the country. But at the same time, I really had to be open to the critiques, right? And I also felt that there were times where I actually had to explain foreign policy and why the US was doing what it was doing, but that also wasn't my role. But there are ways in which your nationality gets read on you and you become the speaker. And so that was something I didn't really realize until I lived abroad. So that was, I think, a pivotal moment for me and something that really showed me what I thought about Americanness.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear about that experience of being in Europe and how that shifts. Jonathan, I want to put you on the spot for a minute because you mentioned that you are from Hawaii, or that you grew up in Hawaii, which is a state that had, I would say, perhaps an unfortunate path into statehood. Really a land that was kind of the victim of American capitalism. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, how that history maybe reflected your sense of being an American as a child or as someone growing up in Hawaii, and how it's shifted over time.
When I was growing up in Hawaii, a long time ago, a very long time ago, that it was essentially a diverse community. And it was at the moment at which the melting pot theory of immigration was at work. Growing up, we were all pretty clear that the melting pot wasn't the melting pot, but that generally people in Hawaii got along because they got along. Part of the problem of Hawaii is that there are these layers, and if you've lived there a long time, you sense that there are layers. Some of those layers have gone away. For example, my parents had an interracial marriage. My paternal grandparents were from Guangdong. My maternal grandmother was Hakka, which was a smaller village in Guangdong province, but the Hakka had moved south from wherever they were originally about 1,000 years before. Obviously, that's not there anymore, and those kinds of things have blended. And so thinking about being an American was, well, we were all Americans. We could all qualify for American passports. And in some ironic ways, as a Chinese American, I'm probably as old as you can get and still be a Chinese and be an American of Chinese descent in terms of generations going back. I'm a fourth generation. I have two grandmothers who were born in Hawaii, just on the eve of the annexation. There are moments, but it is also very clear, particularly if you're of Asian descent, it's never assumed that you were born in the United States. I frequently get asked, well, my English is so good, how long have I lived in this country? More frequent when I was younger, but it still persists every once in a while. And so there's always a tinge that somehow I'm not, and that persists. By the way, my answer is usually long enough to be president of the United States. And it's really interesting to see who gets it and who doesn't. So there are different moments in my life when you talk about being an American and what it means. And in which I embrace it and I think, isn't this wonderful? And there are also moments in which, well, as one example that was in the late 60s and early 70s, when I thought I was going to be eligible for the draft, and it was pointed out to me that I qualified for citizenship in the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. There's an obscure thing that happens when you're of Chinese descent, that if your grandfather registered your name in the village, that you were a citizen, you could claim citizenship. So it's always a kind of mixed thing with me, I think. The bottom line is sort of what Winston Churchill once said about democracy. The worst of all possible situations until you do all the rest.
So I think I want to turn the conversation to David Walker and his writing. Walker frequently, asserted in his writing that Black people had as great a claim, if not a greater claim, on citizenship and belonging because, of the literal and figurative blood and sweat that went into the land. And Cabria, maybe I'll ask you, because I know this aligns with your areas of focus, but was that viewpoint commonly held by 19th century Black Americans?
Absolutely, yes. And I think Jonathan and Jessica have talked about this, but in the early 19th century United States, citizenship was really, ambiguous. It was a term that was constantly being made and remade. And African-American activists played a key role in that process, right, of making and unmaking. And so we can actually see this through their activism and through their political work. And we can also see this in debates within the community, free Black communities especially. So someone like Samuel Cornish, who is an African-American activist and editor, he was involved with the first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. He linked citizenship to military service, to being a taxpayer, and somewhat to conduct, right? And so for him, that's how he defined it. And we might think about the ways that registers with us today, but I think in the 19th century, what we have to keep in mind is him making that argument actually probably did some harm, because he was essentially saying that African Americans might have to be prepared for citizenship, right? Which means they wouldn't immediately be granted citizenship. And I think there's a lot of care that has to be taken in these arguments, right? We're thinking about the 19th century. This is a very difficult time and a difficult context for African Americans. But he's arguing one approach, right? To get African Americans closer to citizenship. Someone like Frederick Douglass actually argues for an international citizenship. And he talks about an international citizenry that goes beyond geographical boundaries. But ultimately, he can't fully theorize that, right? And that can't be fully realized in part because of the pressing and urgent matter of slavery, right? There is this sense with Douglass and among other activists that slavery can be abolished at the federal level. And so in order to push that argument, Black activists really believe in and argue for a national citizenship. But even in these arguments about national citizenship, African-American activists are talking about an ethic, right, that comes with that citizenship. So this is something that Jessica said, right? The duty and contributions of what it means to be a citizen are very much tied to these values of human freedom and equality. And that was something that was very central to the arguments that Douglass made about citizenship.
Interesting. Catherine, I'm wondering, do we have questions in the chat at this point that we should be posing to our panelists?
We have a question and a comment. I believe this refers to when Jonathan was talking about the earliest identification of who would be a citizen. Did they use the term white?
Yes, it's very specific in the 1795. But it is pretty clear that it's not until the 1880s, 1890s that notions of whiteness get coalesced around the term white. I mean, look at the National Origins Acts of 1923-24. The reason there are these different ethnic identifications is because of the presumption that these are different areas of white, different kinds of white. There's a wonderful book, the title of which is When the Irish Became White. And it's the way in which Irish immigrants coming to the United States are seen literally as being non-white or less than Anglo-Saxon. Just the very terms are invented to distinguish people. There's a wonderful speech that takes place during the debates over the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's done by a Massachusetts senator named George Frisbee Hoare, and Hoare is he's as racist as everyone else. One of his great sins is his support for Indian schools that took Indians off the reservation and tried to civilize them. But he's defending, he's opposed to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he says in the Senate, as they're debating this, he says, I remember when the gentlemen in this house whose hair was not gray were opposed to Irish immigration on the very same terms that they're using against the Chinese. and someone stands up and says, well, my ancestors weren't Anglo-Saxon, but we were white too. We Italians are part of the great white race. And that's part of the idea of the situational nature of definitions of whiteness.
Wow. We have a couple of comments now. One is, I have read that the term American was originally used as a derogatory term by the English elite who thought that the new British colonists were primitive. Does anyone want to speak to that? I don't know that I've heard that, but yeah.
I mean, I guess I can talk about this a little bit. There is a tendency, if you look at depictions of America personified as a person, right, to portray America first as an indigenous woman, and she gradually becomes white and European over time in like visual depictions by, you know, the 1770s, 1780s. And part of the reasoning behind this is that, you know, American colonists are trying to position themselves as sort of not being on the periphery of things, but sort of being a world player. And sort of that image evolves with that sense of we're center stage. We're not sort of, again, like on the margins anymore. And that's part of that. Though I would say like there's plenty of evidence in the, you know, prior to the revolution that colonists are claiming American in positive ways. There's a whole series of books that are Americanized, like they have this claim on the title page, Americanized for a, you know, an American audience. And if you look at these books, they often claim that they have like content that's edited for an audience, and you can actually collate them with the British copies that they come from, and kind of track like how that sense of Americanness is changing over time. So like I think there are like different ways like the term American is being you know, thrown around. And one thing I actually sort of wanted to point out earlier about the word is that when David Walker uses the term American, he's very clearly referring to white Americans. Whenever he refers to you know, African Americans, he's using the term like men, people, citizens, right? Like he claims like citizenship, but he doesn't kind of refer to himself as American himself in the text of the appeal.
And we
Okay,
have,
that's interesting. Oh,
we do have a David Walker related question, Nikki.
yeah,
how
that's
do you-
what I was pointing out. Go for it. Yeah.
Go for it. How do you think David Walker used the concept of citizenship strategically to advance the case for abolition?
You know, I guess I could try to tackle that one. I mean, it's complicated because I am trying to like wrap my mind based on the like my reading of the appeal, like what he thinks citizenship is. Like I was thinking about the section on colonization earlier today, where he's pointing out like the various hypocrisies of white Christian America, and he's sort of differentiating himself as someone who should have all the rights like of a citizen. And he's also invoking this thing that Cabria just talked about, like that, you know, part of the reason that he should have the rights of a citizen is because the blood and tears went into the working of the land, which I sat and thought to myself, well, this is a very also Lockean argument, and maybe he's just doing another one of these rhetorical things where he's like putting it back to people who he feels like you're using this language of freedom and legalese, and like here you're not applying it in a reasonable way. But he's like, I think like most of the appeal is like concerned with like this constant hypocrisy that he sees between people who sort of embrace freedom but won't do anything about slavery. Like he doesn't seem to, like he seems to just accept like we are citizens in some ways, in some parts of the appeal, and doesn't really argue that it needs to like happen. It's just that everybody else sort of needs to get on board and resolve these like paradoxical, conflicting understandings of freedom and liberty, because they do not include him. And that's kind of how I state that.
Great. before I ask the next question, Cabria, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that's a great point that that Jessica's mentioned, that in the appeal, Walker doesn't seem to claim the term American for himself, although he does claim citizenship. And it makes me think about, again, this conception of an international citizenship, of a global citizenship, right? He's writing this appeal to the colored citizens of the world. And so this is actually a line, a through line in Black thought. We see it advocated by Walker, but it's also going to come up again in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, this idea of a global citizenship. I would also say that as Walker's working on the appeal and writing the appeal, there is a shift, right, in Black activists claiming the term American. So I'm very interested in Robert Morris. He was an early African-American activist. He was born and raised in Salem in 1824. And he moves to Boston, and he's very much involved in the abolition movement and in the free Black community of Boston. And he's trained as a lawyer, right? He is a legal apprentice. He apprentices with Ellis Gray Loring, who is a white abolitionist and lawyer. And in Morris's later writings, he does say, "I'm an American." He says, "We as Black people are just as American as you." And as Jessica mentioned, he uses some of that language of our blood and sweat and tears have labored on this land. So there is a way that Walker maybe doesn't claim Americanness, right, in the late 1820s. And by the 1850s, someone like Robert Morris does claim Americanness and does claim citizenship. And I think you can see the change in thought. And I think there's a context for that, right? This is 1850, after the fugitive slave law, moving into the Dred Scott decision, right? So there is something at stake here, I think, for Black activists to want to claim Americanness and to claim citizenship.
Nikki, I think there's also another ingredient that, again, it's contextual, in the sense that the whole notion of a kind of trans-state citizenship doesn't exist. People are citizens of individual states, not of the United States. So the term American is in some ways not quite synced up with the notion of a national citizenship. So Walker's appeal to a transnational citizenship is something that he can invoke that supersedes the state authorities that can deny him citizenship, that deny Black citizenship. And it's the universality of Black's experience that gives them the right to those rights.
It's an interesting point, Jonathan, that state, I guess, affinity or identity has kind of waxed and waned in its significance over time, or even kind of a regional identity. And, I think about even today, it's probably different state to state or region to region, or even thinking about people I know who are from and grew up in New York City, like they are New Yorkers for life. It doesn't matter that they've lived in Boston for 20 years, like they're New Yorkers, like that's a part of their identity. And I think we all, depending on where we grew up and where we trace our roots to, maybe think about that a little differently. I do want to shift the conversation a little bit to talk about first the concept of shared history. I think one of the ways that we as humans, as people, find a sense of belonging, it's through personal kind of communal stories, which happens on many levels. If you think about, if you were so fortunate to know your grandparents, right, like the family lore that generations know and connect themselves to. it happens on a community level as well. It happens on a national level, but there are instances where communities have lost their history, or where their history wasn't documented as thoroughly, and relies more on oral traditions. But these narratives help establish a claim to space. And so what happens when those stories are lost, or when they are yet to be recovered? I guess I'll pose that to all of our panelists if anyone wants to jump in there.
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think this is an important question, and really speaks to the work of historians, which is, I think, not a closed field, right? We can all in some ways be historians. I think when these communal stories are lost, we are all bereft, right, by that. I think our historical narratives, particularly about the nation's founding here in the context of the United States, those narratives are partial, right? They're limited because they're told from a narrow perspective. And so we want to reclaim those communal stories so we can tell fuller stories, right? Especially about our nation and our ancestors. And so I think when we don't have those stories, we're deprived, right, of a kind of knowing that we might have otherwise. For the field of African American history, I think, especially in New England, these communal stories have been erased. They have been buried by dominant historical narratives. So I think you do get something like the myth of a white New England, the myth of a white Republican New England, that does not include Indigenous people, that does not often include African Americans. And I think there's a way in which historians and the work of scholars are trying to change that history and revise it. I think when we don't revise it, African Americans get rendered as beneficiaries of change, that African Americans get written out of stories, like in the abolition movement, like someone like David Walker, that African Americans sometimes aren't seen as agents of their own freedom. And they absolutely were, right? African Americans have strengthened the nation's ideals, right? And we can tell those stories and sort of reverse those myths, earlier myths, right? Particularly in this region of New England. And I'm often reminded of the work of someone like William Cooper Nell, who in some ways was a historian, right? He wrote books about African American history in the 19th century. He went to great lengths to talk about the contributions of African Americans to the founding of the nation, and he published this, right? These books. And for him, that was vital, right? That history was vital, and he was passing that down. So there is the oral tradition, but you actually have Black historians in the early 19th century who were keepers of this history and really interested in sharing that history. And so I think that is important, the oral tradition, but also the material that we do have that was written down.
That's fascinating. Does anyone else, Jessica or Jonathan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so this is actually something I'm very interested in recovering with the virtual reality project that we're working on at Northeastern. Walker is very attuned to issues of space and belonging. When you read the appeal for like issues of space and belonging, like for example, like in the third edition, there's this account of an African American man, Frederick Brimsley, being ousted from the Park Street Church, even though he's paid for a pew. If you look at the writings of his contemporaries, like Hosea Easton, he has this very famous account of walking the streets and seeing all these sort of racist caricatures and feeling out of sorts in the space that he occupies. So even though we hear a lot about Boston and its abolitionist history, like there are just, spaces that were deeply racist, and Walker was very aware of this. And sort of necessarily, all of these African-American families who are clustered around Beacon Hill, they need spaces of their own to have certain conversations, to build community, and to organize for social change. And, you know, if you look at the literature on early American politics, like this emphasizes this participation in the public sphere and public engagement. And, you know, for the Black community, like there had to be use of these very private spaces as protection against racism and in response to exclusion from public spaces. But how did these narratives change when we think about these lost histories, right? Like, you know, when we lose this narrative, like we just tell a partial story. And I agree, like historians are very good at navigating these silences, but there are so many stories about Walker that I'd like people to know about. Like, what is it like to be a young Black family living on Beacon Hill in the 1820s? What is it like to be a Black businessman in a strip of space that hosted Black businesses? Where and how did Walker participate in sort of various activist networks that sought social change? When I walk over Beacon Hill on a regular basis, like I don't see like the visible signs of this story. I mean, I think about it, but it makes me sad that like other people aren't prompted to think about it. And so I'm trying to think about the project that we're working on as like a hook into these stories.
I think Jessica raises a really interesting point. She's trained to look for these things. And part of the way in which we teach history, we tend to teach a victor's history. We tend to teach the history of people who started writing a long time ago and decided what were the significant stories we should tell. And when we combine it with a kind of directed notion of what constitutes civics, you always have to be chary of who's telling you what the civics are. Because sometimes those are instruments, in my more cynical moments, instruments of lazy historians. In my better moments of, well, they just didn't have access to the kind of imagination or the kind of reflection that a new generation of historians brought to the perspective. Much of these forgotten stories are brought up because, and I've seen this in the course of my own career, is that a new generation of historians have learned to listen to silence. They've learned to listen to the empty spaces where there is noise and there are voices that can be heard and whose stories can be told when it's not obvious.
Jessica, it's interesting, you know, you're talking about physical space, right? And like curiosity of physical space. And I think when we see how visitors interact with the space at Old North and with the site, you know, some folks connect to stories about people. I think that's a primary way that people can kind of ground themselves in the history of a place. But then there are others who are really drawn to the tangible aspect of being at a historic site. You know, I think you see it when people walk in the door. You know, you can see the emotion overcome them, particularly those for whom Old North is a bit of a pilgrimage or has been on their, you know, American Revolution bucket list. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the virtual reality project and, you know, how it's helping to give people that sense of place, particularly as we think about all of the, you know, both whole neighborhoods, but, you know, buildings of significance that have been lost in Boston.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So if you go out to Beacon Hill today, right, there's a nice plaque actually on about 80 Joy Street that corresponds to 8 Belknap Street, where Walker rented a house between 1827 and 1829. But there's not really a lot of space to do interpretive work sort of beyond that plaque, right? Like it's a residential home that's owned by somebody. There are some aspects of the original space that survive, but it's been remodeled and redone. And like the other kind of physical spaces that Walker occupied, there was a apartment he rented on South X Street, and like a second house on Bridge Street, which is now the Massachusetts General Hospital campus, a store on Brattle Street that's been totally obliterated by urban renewal. Like I've actually been out to the cemetery and South Street, like looking for some sort of visible sign of Walker at his gravesite, and he's just entombed 12, and there's no sign that you would know that he was laid to rest there. And so I kept thinking, like, Boston is so rich with public historical work in some way or another, like just by walking around. Like, what do you do when there's competing claims to a space to tell historical stories, right? Like, even if we had a space to devote to Walker, like there potentially could be other stories that occupy the same space, like that could lay claim to it. So for me, like these virtual reality museums that we're working on at Northeastern that recreate his home, his shop, they let us create like a teaching memorial that conveys historical themes by examining recreations of key artifacts that are deeply based on archival research. And I think, like, there are practical reasons why this works as well, right? Like if you think about the labor of, like, let's say we had a space on Joy Street to do this work, like this costs a ton of money. We'd have to like have the house, right? You guys know, right? Like you need to have people to just staff the house. You need to have objects to do the interpretation. Where do you get this stuff? There are far fewer financial and spatial hurdles to making digital surrogates, like based on our interpretive archival research. And I want to be able to give these spaces back to the Boston community, because Walker's story is one that I think needs to be more visible in like a sea of different competing histories in Boston. I don't think I'm wrong in saying that most of these histories are very white and very much about the American Revolution, and like this triumphant narrative about the spread of freedom. And there's sort of less public memorial on sort of the people who challenged the persistence of inequality in the early republic. And I think that like Walker can help us, and Walker, his family, and the community that he lived in can help us to understand these narratives better.
Yeah, it's you raise an interesting point that in many places, as neighborhoods turn over, for example, even thinking about the North End and thinking about first of all, like humans who have inhabited the Shawmut Peninsula over large spans of time that predate European settlement, but thinking about how many times the neighborhood of the North End as we kind of know it today has turned over, that in a city like Boston, there could be a home that has many points of significance in its several centuries of trajectory. And who claims that space, who gets to interpret it in person. It's an interesting thing to think about. Fortunately, in the church, it's just us, so that's not that's not one of our complexities at Old North. Catherine, are there any questions from our audience?
Yes, we do, but I did want to ask Jessica how people will be able to experience these virtual museums when they're ready.
So I think this is something that is going to require some planning. We're developing this for the Oculus Quest. And so there are multiple forms of delivery that like we have imagined for this. I previously directed a virtual reality project about women in science. And we will probably take some of that model that kind of adopts kind of a hybrid like human interpreter in virtual reality and a standalone model. And the advantage, I think, to having a hybrid version, and this I imagine is sort of like a setup where somebody could go into a museum or an internet space and explore the VR simulation with somebody who is trained to answer questions about it, is that like I like the work that museum interpreters do, right? And I think there's benefit from having like a live person like respond to somebody as they move through a virtual recreation of the space, so the person can get some of the information in virtual reality in context. And partly because you know, like a written argument, recreation of a space, like physical or digital, is a series of choices. And I think it's useful to have somebody on hand to like explain those choices, because there's so much we don't know about Walker. And, you know, I don't want people like getting an immersive reality thinking like, oh, this is the absolute truth. I'm like right, like I want that historical interpretive opinion. I also kind of imagine that there will be sort of like a curated version where people can like download it remotely, load it into like an Oculus, and like walk through and interact with objects on their own.
We have a question for the panelists. Do you think that in order to gain the legal right to citizenship, others like Blacks and women sought to define what it meant to be American as a set of values or ideologies, a belief system, if you will, rather than based on race or gender? Jonathan, you look like you're coming up with an answer there.
Yes.
The answer is
I think that that's part of it. It's when people who are outside seeking to obtain the rights help to define it. I mean, Jefferson knew what he meant by equality. It meant he kind of meant rich white guys like him were equal and they were inferiors. It took people who were who took that very definition and that language and took it on, appropriated it for themselves. And the whole notion of equality is terribly vague anyway. But it lends itself to being appropriated by people who, for lack of a better term, are outside the system, or who seek a redress of grievance and can only obtain it by arrogating rights that they've been denied. I mean, in many ways, the legal system is an outcome-determined reasoning. You get the prize if you're already in the system. If you're not in the system, you don't get the prize. And one way to make sure you don't get the prize is to keep you out of the system. This is really, a lot of this is seen at work in early 17th and 18th century relationships to Native Americans. Native Americans enter into the legal system with one set of notions about what constitutes ownership. And the Anglo-American legal system has a pretty specific definition of what constitutes ownership. And for the most part, always, the Native American loses. One of the ironies is that in our modern age, we tend to use variants of what Native Americans see as rights of property. That they're seen as different attributes of use, not as absolute ownership to do whatever you want with the property that you own.
That's true. Yeah. We also have I guess a semi-philosophical question. Should we really use the term American to begin with? Not only are Canadians living in the Americas, but so are Mexicans living in the Americas. Cabria, maybe you'd like to answer this. I too lived abroad, and this was something that came up a lot with, when I would be with other North Americans.
Right. How did those of us from the United States end up dominating the term and using it? I mean, I will say that in my own work, I've tried to refer to those who are claiming citizenship in the United States as those people from the United States, right? I don't like to use the term American. And so I usually, in my writing, and I usually steer clear of that. And I don't think even in my way of describing myself that I would describe myself as American, as much as I would say I'm from the United States. So I've always tried to be very clear about that. And in part because of that sense of dominance, right? That American equals United States, and let's not even talk about South America, right? Or Central America. So I think I'm cognizant of that. And I think other scholars have been cognizant of that too. So we are trying to make changes in how we write. But if I could come back to a point that Jonathan made earlier about sort of these challenges to the definition of citizenship, I think that's so very important, right? This point that citizenship is being made and remade. And I noticed this too, as I said, when I traveled abroad and when I got my passport, right? I was sort of looking at those stamps in my passport. But in the more recent ones, there are quotes at the top of each page from Americans, right? From those who claim US citizenship, Daniel Webster, Martin Luther King Jr. But there's also a quote there from Anna Julia Cooper, which surprised me. And perhaps it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Because most people don't know who Anna Julia Cooper was. They don't know that she was a writer, that she was an activist, that she was an advocate for equality and freedom. She was born into slavery, and right before the Civil War, but did all that she could, right, to leave a better United States, right, a better society, and she was a Southern woman. And there's this quote from her in the passport, and it says, the cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity. And I thought this is such a powerful quote because it's women like her, Black women like her, who are challenging these definitions of citizenship. But she's talking about our collective obligation as human beings, right? To borrow David Walker's phrase again, as citizens of the world, to end oppression. And so there's something about that cuts across geographical boundaries, right? That really sort of binds us as a human family. And I appreciated that. And I think that's such an important quote as we're thinking about and defining freedom, but also thinking about citizenship. And I think she appreciated this too, probably because she studied abroad. She got her PhD in history at the Sorbonne in Paris. So she had that experience of traveling. And she also may have been aware of the difficulties of African Americans, especially obtaining passports, right? In the middle toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century.
We have another question. I know legislation barred Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and Black people from citizenship at different times. Did white European immigrants face any barriers to full citizenship in the 19th century, like waiting periods before receiving voting rights or anything? I don't know who might want to handle that.
Throughout the 19th century, citizenship is defined by state status. If you're a resident of a state, you are in fact a citizen. You can become a citizen of the United States. There is no, technically, their national citizenship only occurs after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And what the 14th Amendment and subsequent lines of legislation does is to essentially make white and then African citizenship possible, naturalization possible. Asians, 1951 or 52, I think, it starts to change. The 1952 has to do with the Korean War, when they remove racial categories and make ideological categories. It's kind of a joke. If only if you're red, then can you be barred from being an American? Communist, not race.
Right. Um,
Catherine, I'm seeing a comment in the chat that I really like from Liz, which is that history is literally contested space, both physically and figuratively, which is, I think, an interesting way to think about, you know, how we are trying to evolve our programming at Old North. You know, people who are, you know, fans and friends of our organization know that we went through a strategic planning process earlier this year. And as part of that, our organization articulated a vision for the future, kind of a big picture, blue sky vision of the future that we hope to see, in which all Americans see themselves, their stories, their struggles, and their hopes reflected in places of prominence and in our nation's shared history. So I want to pose an open-ended question to the panelists, and I'll get some like pro bono consulting here out of this. How do you think we can work towards that future? What should historic sites like Old North be thinking about in terms of how we engage the public in our space and how we create a shared sense of community?
Well, I can chime in first here. You know, I think this is a great moment to be doing this work, to be sort of thinking about moving in maybe a slightly different direction in terms of the strategic plan. I come back to David Walker here, and I think about his appeal, and I think about the work of 19th century Black activists and then Black activists in the 20th century. There is a work of recovery, right, that's necessary here to bring some of these stories that have been erased, that have been hidden, to unearth those stories. But I think there's another part of Walker that's really important and that Black activists talked about, and that is redress, right? And I think that has to in some ways be at the center of the work that cultural organizations are committed to, right? Not just recovery, but redress. And so this isn't just about stitching together stories from fragments, right, that were once forgotten or discarded, but it's also about recovering from the harm that was done in perpetuating this myth of a free white New England, right? There's harm that's been done in that narrative, in that myth. And part of the recovery and part of the redress is to undo, right, that myth, right, and challenge it. And I don't think that means writing out white people in New England's history. I mean, sometimes people take it that way. That's not at all what I mean. I mean, it's bringing more people into that history, right? Making it so that we see different perspectives on how we all sort of are building and contributing to you know, this state, this city, this country, right? It's not just one particular group whose perspective we see things from. So I think unearthing these history is further dislodging that myth and then expanding what we know about those who came before us. And I think Old North is committed to that. And that's what's exciting to me about the way forward.
I can't remember exactly what he says, so I'm paraphrasing it, but in George Washington's farewell address, he says something about having a shared history. And if we leave out the stories that have been deliberately left out or forgotten, and we don't integrate them with the stories we already know, we will lose something fundamental. And Washington saw this when he you know, in some ways we too easily forget that when Washington was giving his farewell address, the United States was barely a decade old. Lots of countries don't last that long. And one of the reasons that this country has is because maybe it's been forced to, maybe it's done so dragging its feet, but it's been forced to make its story universal. And the more universal we make it, the more places like Old North become parts of everybody's history. And that's really important at a time in which we're not so sure that this experiment's going to last.
I feel like going last is very tricky because I agree with both folks who went before me. You know, I do think like I'm very glad that you put together this panel tonight and have been putting together panels like it because you know, telling stories that are diverse and giving folks the ability to access them is sort of step one in this process, and step two is sort of thinking about I think as Cabria points out, like how these stories can be used to promote healing. Like I don't believe that the country has really had like the discussion that they need to have about the legacies of slavery and racism. You know, other countries have handled sort of histories of problematic pasts in like a variety of different ways. But like some of the better ones, in my opinion, are the ones that promote kind of a national dialogue about this. And I do think that cultural institutions can help us to deal with these problematic pasts and like put those histories out there in a way that I think is meaningful and not just sort of you know, politicians railing against things that they don't entirely understand. And so like I appreciate like you like trying to start these conversations and inviting scholars in to talk about these stories. And I imagine that this is something you're going to be doing going forward, and I'm very excited to see like what happens.
Wonderful. Some good insights here, and all things that we are thinking about, both as we plan for kind of new and evolving interpretation of the church and the surrounding historic site, but also our virtual programming as well, and the types of materials that we make available for schools really across the country. So I am mindful of the time, and I do want to just share a few things as we wrap up. For those who are local, we will next be open for visitors during February school vacation week. And so for those of you who have children or not, or who may just be looking for something to do that week, we welcome friendly faces to come and visit us. We'll be launching a new family tour geared toward children to help them interact with and learn from the space. Catherine mentioned earlier that our next speaker series event is coming up in March, and that will focus on the role that some of the many roles that women played in the American Revolution. And I encourage everyone to just check out our website. We have a lot of resources available, including an archive of past speaker series events that includes the first two events on David Walker, who is just a tremendously impactful and fascinating person. And so I encourage everyone who missed the first two events to check that out. And I'll just say before we wrap, is there anything that any of our panelists would like to add or close out with? Plug any books you're writing, any events that you have coming up, et cetera, et cetera.
I feel like I forgot to say this earlier, but if you're interested in the progress of the 3D project, it's 3d.blackboston.com, and I can stick that in chat.
Great, thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to everybody. This was a fascinating panel and a great discussion. I also want to thank those of you in our virtual audience who've been with us through these three different approaches to learning about David Walker, his life and his legacy. I feel as though it's been quite a full exploration, and yet I know that there is so much more to learn and understand about this man. So thank you for being with us. And again, thank you and good night.